world fighting corruption in the new Trump era. At the start, I want to thank our sponsors and partners for this event, the UK Anti-Corruption Coalition. We're here to talk about today how corruption is a major challenge for the UK, undermining our public services, economic stability, security and national resilience. During the COVID pandemic, over £12 billion was spent on PPE, around £4 billion on stuff that failed to meet NHS standards. Much of it has been either burnt or is locked away in storage containers that are costing taxpayers millions of pounds. Our financial, legal and accountancy sector is also amongst the biggest in the world, which is fantastic news for our economy, but it's also incredibly attractive for those who want to move illicit finance or commit economic crime. And I think particularly during the since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we've seen foreign oligarchs and kleptocrats who have used the UK financial system to disguise their ill-gotten wealth, siphoning resources away from their country and their citizens. But of course, it's not just Russian oligarchs. So what that indicates is that there are serious weaknesses and corruption risks within the UK, which hopefully we're going to talk about how to tackle. But it's not just about the UK. I think we're also going to talk about that there needs to be a collective international effort to tackle illicit financial flows, bribery and economic crime, particularly in the context of the United States, which has undermined efforts since Donald Trump took power, with the closure of the Department of Justice kleptocracy team and a pause on all foreign bribery enforcement. So that's not necessarily a cheery start to the poll, but hopefully we're going to have some solutions and some optimism about how we're going to tackle corruption and economic illicit financial flows. Just before I start, Baroness Hodge is unable to make it, so obviously sad that she can't make it. However, we are going to have a fantastic discussion nonetheless. And I start with Liam Byrne, MP. Liam Byrne is the MP for Birmingham, Hodge Hill, Solihull North, having won a predecessor seat in 2004. Liam, I'm sure you're aware, is chair of the Business and Trade Committee and a member of the National Security Strategy Joint Committee. He has held several ministerial briefs and is also a Fabian exec, which I don't know how you judge them in terms of commitments, but over to you, Liam.
Great. Sorry, just before we go, can we use the microphones, please? Just because we've got the camera and we need that to pick up. So apologies. Thank you.
Great. Well, look, thank you very much indeed for that. Let me just sort of share with you some of the research that is going into a new book, which is out, I can now declare, on the 26th of March next year, which is on why populists are winning and how we beat them. One of the arguments in the book is that you cannot understand the rise of populism today unless you understand the money. And of course, it was Mark Hanna, US Senator, once presidential campaign manager, who said that there are only two things to remember in politics. The first is money, and I can't remember what the second one is. And that truth today is alive and well. And so, understanding the business model behind populism is incredibly important in understanding how to defeat populism. And if we want to avoid the peril, it's the 3 A's of populism, autocracy at home, appeasement abroad, and avarice everywhere. If we want to defeat that kind of politics, then we have to understand and take apart the business model of populism with a vigour which a couple of us, we not, hope to bring to the floor of the House of Commons when the elections bill is presented soon. So look, let me just set the stage by just reminding everybody about the scale, and then I'll just mention a couple of things about some of the evolution of dark money, because even today you can see a real evolution against some of the sins that we were taking aim at, Mark Woodline, a couple of years ago. So we just looked at a 4-year period in researching the book, from 2020 through to about early 2024. In that period alone, we could track about 4,000 transactions from about 555 people. Grand total of that money flow, £158 million. So, this is not an insignificant number. This is not an insignificant investment. This is not an insignificant risk. This is finance on a completely new kind of scale. But there are three things to kind of understand about the new scale of this money. The first is that you can't understand political finance today without understanding the finance that is going into the media political system. So a little bit like the military-industrial complex of the 1950s, this is a new kind of political economy. And so when you look at that 150 plus million, overwhelmingly most of that money is going into media systems. But from the media systems, it is going into the pockets of parliamentarians who serve for a particular party in the House of Commons. Curiously enough, just to enshrine the interest, one of those politicians owns 500,000 shares in one of those media organisations. So you've now got this kind of fusion between populist media, populist parties, and populist politicians, and you can't really understand what is going on in the world of populism unless you can kind of map that out. Now, as it happens, when you then do a network analysis, an online analysis of how different forces are connected into that media system, we've done an exercise where we've mapped like the 200 biggest influencers in these networks. What you see is that overwhelmingly what that populist investment is doing in the UK is creating an echo chamber for American populists. And of course, because of the force of today's algorithms, once you're connected to one or two of those, you are sucked into a dark, almost sealed world in which you are just served a feed of reel after reel after reel, hate after hate, and after hate. So the first thing to kind of bear in mind is that you can't understand dark money today in politics unless you are really taking apart the map of the media political system. Second, we cannot ignore now the force of algorithms and the way that algorithms dial up hate, but the way hate leads to money. So if you look at the amount of ad revenue generated through hate speech on X and other platforms in the wake of the Southport riots, it's about £50,000 in 7 days. So you've now got algorithms that are keyed to dialing up the language of hate, but that hate is triggering a revenue flow which is going to basically the rage-tainment producers. But guess what? It's also going to a number of politicians. So if you look again, we just looked at a 7-month period, about £44,000 going into the bank accounts of reform politicians from Twitter alone. So the monetization of division is now the second new dynamic in populist funding. And the third, which is not shown up here, but sure as hell is showing up in the United States and elsewhere, not least in Moldova, is cryptocurrency. And so if you want to just completely transform the risk of political finance, just allow cryptocurrency donations. The fact that you can anonymize who actually hosts the account, the fact that you can create mixer accounts, when you look at the amount of money that was pouring into countries like Moldova through cryptocurrency, it just kind of lights up the risk that we now confront. And guess who it is who is campaigning for cryptocurrency donations here in the UK? So you've now got these really significant new patterns in the evolution of dark money, but there's just kind of one final risk to flag really, which is that populist politicians are not simply trying to cash flow, they're trying to capitalise. So again, if you look at what President Trump has done with the creation first of Trump Media, but more recently with World Liberty Financial, if you look at the kind of money that the New Yorker has recently tracked in what was a groundbreaking study, billions of pounds is now being raised through the capitalisation of access. So it's not merely the cash flows that are coming in, it is the way that politicians are capitalising it. So if you begin looking into the accounts of, let's take a random example, Thorn in Your Side Media, owner, Entourage, just look at how that cash reserve has changed over the course of the last year. Can you imagine what tax rate Mr. Farage is paying on the dividends coming out of that? I can guarantee you it's not 40% higher rate tax. So, again, that kind of capitalisation gives you a leverage of some of these monies that are coming in. So we have a chance to do something about it that's coming up in the House of Commons in the next, well, we don't really know. It's sort of imminent, isn't it? But I think the message from many of us is do not present this bill until it is right. And so unless this bill can take on many of the risks that Susan and others have campaigned on, like unincorporated associations, and unless it bans cryptocurrency donations, then we are opening ourselves up to the risk of a flood tide of dark money coming in to this country. Now, final point, when you look at where some of this money is coming from, you can see now that it is coming from some very strange places. We have all kinds of rumours at this stage, which we're working on substantiating, about the way in which cryptocurrency donations is now the currency of choice, the Russian intelligence services, flowing that money into Western proxies in Western Europe and elsewhere. The CIA latest estimate is that about $30 to $33 million a year has been flowing from Russian intelligence services into the bank accounts of Western populist parties and all their proxies. And then there is new research that shows that on a similar scale, you've got money coming in particular from the American Christian right. So, when you kind of put all these things together, it's not a surprise to see and feel how strong the forces of authoritarian politics are now, because actually the spigots of cash that are pouring into this cause are significant. And these are not people who are financing political parties for the common good. They're financing these parties for their self-interest. So it's a huge fight ahead of us. We've got the chance to get it right, and we need to make sure we do get it right. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Liam, for that. Now we'll turn to Phil Brickle, who is the Labour MP for Bolton West, elected in July 2024. In Parliament, Phil serves on several parliamentary groups, including the APPG on anti-corruption and responsible tax. He's also a member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, and very relevant before politics, Phil was head of anti-bribery and corruption at both NatWest, and then before that, Barclays. Phil, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think I'll have a few upbeat vignettes, hopefully, as I go through today, some of the solutions to the issue that faces us. But I think Liam's picture, in particular around crypto, as to the risk to our democratic process, to our politics, is entirely accurate. And we do live in very strange times, very peculiar times. In fact, in a way, I thought it was almost unthinkable to come and speak at a conference only a matter of days after a Welsh politician pleaded guilty to accepting bribes on behalf of the Russian government. I mean, it just goes to depict the scale of the threat and the nature. But I do want to remind people that this isn't just about Russia-Ukraine. Often the dialogue that we've had about dark money, about dirty money, about corruption, even about improving standards in public life has been framed about Russia's full-scale lawful invasion of Ukraine. Having worked in the anti-corruption sector for 15 years before I came to Parliament, there's a long tail to this in the UK economy, and there's a long list of issues that need to be resolved. I do think a really important point that was made at the start, we're talking about tackling corruption in the new Trump era, that there is an immense opportunity which presents itself that is glaring us in the face, which is the confirmation by the DOJ that they don't want to pursue Foreign Corrupt Practices Act prosecutions, gives the UK an opportunity to burnish its credentials on the international stage as a key financial services sector, and especially in the run-up to the illicit finances summit that David Lammy confirmed at the UN General Assembly the other day is going to be going ahead in May. There is a real opportunity there for the UK government to act as a convening power, but also to say, actually, what will happen following the introduction of the UK Bribery Act in 2010, which is now long established here, which is landmark legislation in the UK and in Europe, that we are going to pick up the gauntlet now in terms of enforcement, in terms of acting as a deterrent, but also, importantly, seizing up the opportunity that could be put in place were we to have an effective whistleblower reward system, which is frankly attracting intelligence from the other side of the Atlantic that our intelligence agencies can act on. And that's what the Serious Fraud Office has told me they're clamouring for. And actually, there can even be a financial reward to the Treasury, should we wish to set it up in that way. So there are opportunities there. I think one of the things I have spoken to in Parliament is also making sure that our enforcement agencies are properly resourced financially. So there are rules in place around the likes of the CPS, the NCA, the SFO, which hinder their ability to go after organised crime and after those who are seeking to put illicit finance around our economy. I put down an amendment to the crime policing bill earlier this year, which was asking the government to consult on providing a economic crime fighting fund to those agencies to put them on a more sustainable financial footing, and frankly to say that the criminals must pay in terms of putting that money, reinvesting it, hypothecating it into the fight against dirty money, and making sure that it's actually used not in the wider treasury pot, but it's used to go after economic crime writ large. And we'll be hoping to bring that back again in the Lords in due course, so watch this space. There was mention made briefly earlier of the elections bill, which will be going to Parliament in due course. We had a strategy document and a brief statement in the House back in the summer. The glaring omission for me is around crypto. As far as I'm concerned, this is a solution in search of a problem, a bit like photo ID was for voting. But it's telling that Nigel Farage made the announcement that Reform will be accepting cryptocurrency donations at a conference in Las Vegas to a whole host of American attendees, none of whom are eligible to donate into UK politics. I think that speaks volumes, and I don't see why a Labour government would tolerate crypto featuring into our political financing rules when we know how volatile instruments can be, how prone they are to manipulation, and how difficult it would be for the Electoral Commission to actually be able to confirm whether or not certain financial value thresholds were exceeded. Of course, tied with that is welcome development that the government set out clearly wanting to increase enforcement powers for the Electoral Commission. £20,000, which is the maximum fine that can be imposed at the moment, is nothing more than an operational risk for many political parties. It's frankly not good enough. It's been the laughing stock in my opinion. But also there's work to do in terms of further entrenching the operational independence of the Electoral Commission, which I think we desperately do need to see coming forwards. There's a whole host of work that we can do as well around how this ties back to trust in politics and wider standards in public life. I think it's really important to bear in mind that when we talk about corruption, we also often talk about illicit financial flows. When trust is low in politics as a force for good, it is incumbent on the Labour Party as a vehicle for social justice to be advancing those arguments, both in terms of the economy, but also how politics can work as a force for good. I think that's something we often forget about. We often have the classic thought of cash in round envelopes, and that's not how this manifests itself often. And the other thing I will say is we're having a lot of discussions and campaigning locally in my constituency about the rise of cash-intensive front businesses, and the NCA did a very good briefing, which unfortunately I couldn't attend, but I've heard good things about in terms of their Operation Mechanise, which took place earlier this year, cracking down on front businesses up and down the length of the country, whether they're vape shops, whether they're candy stores. We've all read about how this can manifest itself. That's not to say all those stores are from businesses, because clearly they're not, but this is an issue that has real resonance, I think, for members of Parliament up and down the length and breadth of the country, because it shows how organised crime and illicit financial flows can be tied into some of the really visceral criminality that's happening on people's doorsteps, whether that's drugs, whether that's modern slavery, whether that's other forms of crime. And I think we will continue to see a trend of focus on high street money laundering. And Reform is leaning into that. We need to have the answers in the Labour Party about how we're going to address it, making sure that our agencies are properly enforced, but also making sure that it isn't a vehicle that's used by the far right to peddle racism and sow division as well. So I think there are some real opportunities. The Illicit Finance Summit, the elections bill, we're going to have an anti-corruption strategy coming later in the year, which from what I've seen and what I've heard talking to officials in the Home Office is really ambitious, is comprehensive. I'm hoping to see a draft of that in fairly short order. But there is a lot of work to do. Margaret Hodge, it's a shame she can't be here, she's just come back from the BVIs, and we have clear issues around some of the British overseas territories and lack of transparency in their public records won't be taken seriously, won't be able to convene power in the run-up to that illicit finance summit if we can't get our own overseas territories over the line when it comes to registers of beneficial ownership as well. So there's a lot to do, there's a lot of ground to cover, but I am optimistic, and I've heard very good feedback from the likes of Stephen Doughty in the Foreign Office about taking this seriously and showing real leadership.
I will now turn to Dr. Susan Hawley, who is Executive Director of Spotlight on Corruption, charity dedicated to ending corruption both within the UK and wherever the UK is influenced. Susan has over 2 decades of experience on this topic, researching and campaigning for the UK to implement robust anti-corruption measures and tackle the country's role as a facilitator of global corruption. Over to you.
Thanks very much. Ooh, hard to follow those inspiring speeches a while ago. I'm actually here as co-chair of the UK Anti-Corruption Coalition. Shout out to my colleagues at the back who are part of that coalition and other organisations like Transparency International and Foreign Policy Centre who are part of it. We work very closely together. So I wanted to say a little bit just about how Trump has vacated the anti-corruption space and how important it is for the UK. It's kind of its moral duty now, actually, to step up and take a leadership role globally on this. And it's partly, as Phil says, we have a huge reach with our overseas territories and crime dependencies. We also have a long history as a magnet for some very, very dirty money. But we also actually have a bit of a good story to tell. So the last summit in 2016 led to quite a lot of good things. So the summit that you mentioned, Phil, it's super important that that is ambitious and it has some, really strong input of the UK getting its own house in order to make that work and raise global standards. And it's just so important now, like Trump, it's not just that they've completely vacated the anti-corruption field, they are actively dismantling anti-corruption checks and balances in the US, and I think there are real risks that it's actually heading towards becoming a kleptocracy and very authoritarian now at that. So I think, now really is the moment for the UK to take a stand and show that it is going to really protect these norms, these international norms about fighting corruption and democracy. So I was just going to very briefly talk about 3 key areas for this that's critical for the UK to show leadership on. One is on corporate transparency, which my colleagues at Transparency International have done a lot of work on. Critical to a clean growth agenda, and the benefits of good corporate transparency, about £500 million a year to businesses. That's the latest government assessments. UK has been undertaking quite a lot of upgrades. It's trying to root out the companies called crazy things like Adolf Toothberry Hitler that have been lurking on our corporate register. But bringing in new checks, and as Phil says, Margaret Hodge has been over in the BVI harassing them to actually stop being laggards and do the right thing. And at the same time that Trump is actually rolling back corporate transparency. Just January last year they had a new Corporate Transparency Act, which was like a major achievement. They've introduced now a rule that says it only applies to foreign companies, so no US companies now will have to have check beneficial ownership. The UK also has to go further. This is where the leadership can come in. Trusts, major issue. Transparency International found £64 billion worth of property hidden behind trusts in the UK. The UK is falling behind the EU on trusts, so it's a really key area. And actually Dan Needle, I'm sure most of you know, I don't need to explain who he is, but tax expert, found just in July various fraudulent banks made things like JP Morgan Inc. or things like extraordinary that they're still being set up on our corporate register. Enforcement, really pleased to hear you say that, Phil. This is actually what Trump has done in the US is really alarming. He's closed down the kleptocracy unit, which was mentioned in the introduction, and it's difficult to kind of explain how devastating that is. And that is a unit that actually recovered $300 million worth of funds stolen by General Abacha from Nigeria and returned it to Nigeria. It returned over nearly $1.5 billion to Malaysia, which was stolen through the major 1MDB scandal. And this was a very, very effective unit, and the US had real leadership. Most of the foreign bribery enforcement was led by the US, and it has been completely decimated. It's, now the FCPA will only be used against foreign companies. So this it's an opportunity, as Phil says. But we have some great law enforcement units. We've got an international corruption unit, we've got an international anti-corruption coordination centre. But we need the virtuous circle, as Phil says, of reinvestment. But we also need to make sure that the aid cuts don't actually pull the rug out of some of these units, because some of them are funded by aid money. And we also really need to use sanctions better. There was a really promising start of the Labour government to using the anti-corruption sanctions really robustly. But we've seen some real failures recently, like Georgia, really key example, like how it's so egregious, I think, that you could have a country where anti-corruption activists, journalists are just being jailed, and it has been run by some very, very corrupt authoritarian people, and it's just that's so important as part of this enforcement group. Very quickly, finally, enablers. We mentioned lawyers at the beginning and accountants. Yes, we are a leading legal services exporter. We have a less good story to tell here. Still about 30%, a third of UK regulated companies and law firms are not fully compliant with the money laundering regulations. It's like, the last new ones brought in 2017, were kind of 8 years ago. How can that be? You have such a huge percentage. 22 fragmented different supervisors, and that decision is still on the third minister's desk, to really try and consolidate and get better anti-money laundering supervision. And we've still only ever had one money laundering prosecution of a business in the UK. And I think as Trump, really ramping up some, crypto, rolling out crypto, we know how risky it is for dirty money. There's our concern is that there's too much focus on deregulation as a part of the growth agenda, which is a real mistake, because at the end of the day, you cannot have clean growth if you don't actually stop dirty money coming into the country. It will not be sustainable growth.
Thank you, Sue. Before I turn to Kat, just a reminder, we've got a Q&A after this, and that is a Q&A, so question and answers, not statements and answers. I'm going to be very tough on this. So Kat Neelan is a journalist and Whitehall editor of The Observer, and I should say thank you so much for stepping in at the last minute to be here. Over to you, Kat.
Thanks. So I really want to talk about two things. Firstly, managing new forms of, or new vehicles for money better, but also managing old forms and old vehicles of how money gets into our system better. So starting with the new ones, I think that we've heard quite a lot about crypto, and I share a lot of the concerns from the panellists here. This is something which is already kind of racing away from us, and we are sort of struggling to keep up with it. We've seen already there is sort of limited information about what kind of crypto is actually going into political parties at the minute, but there were crypto companies that were sponsoring a four-party conference. Two of them we have found are already breaking company law because they are ultimately owned by companies that are listed in the BVI or Guernsey. So that would suggest already things are not quite at the standards that we would like them to be. One of my colleagues also found that the Tommy Robinson March was sponsored by a crypto firm, which is also currently under investigation in America. Now, the problem with the Tommy Robinson side of things, which makes it even more opaque, is that because this isn't a political party, he will never have to declare his money. And although that was also co-sponsored or co-partnered by Advance, which is Ben Habib's new outfit, that has not yet formally been registered with the Electoral Commission. So any money that went into his party, we also won't ever be able to find out. And of course, we know that Elon Musk spoke at that event. There was a lot of language that kind of implied that it wasn't just his time that he was giving, but frankly, we'll never know unless someone sort of leaks a bank document or something. You know, there is just not that sort of level of transparency. And just to pick up on the points that Sue was making about Companies House, you have these other situations where you have maybe Alka-Seltzer companies where they are set up, donate, and then disappear or are dissolved. And we're not even in a situation where our agencies and authorities are able to chase those companies with the systems that we have at the minute. So I think with the kind of development of technology and the pace of change, I'm quite concerned that that is going to spiral into something even more impossible to keep tabs on. But the thing that I really wanted to talk about today is about the ecosystem, and it touches a bit on some of the points that Liam was making around the sort of American media and parties, but really what I want to talk about is think tanks, because we are seeing quite a lot of replicas of American think tanks being set up here, or ones with very, very close links to American equivalents. Some of them are being bankrolled by American companies and American donors. Some of them are being bankrolled by Hungarian entities. And we have no way of really keeping tabs on this. Of course, there are some organisations like Labour Together, obviously very memorably, did have to declare its donations eventually, because that's a members' organisation, but in general think tanks do not operate under the same level of oversight as political parties. And we know that in the sort of New World Order, where you have these new parties forming that don't have the sort of established mainstream party structure, they don't have the kind of wherewithal to develop their own policies, to hire their own SPADs or advisors, or to go through candidate selection. And we know that some of these groups are explicitly doing that, and they are explicitly taking a political role. They are shaping possible future government policy for us, you know, because if we take reform as a serious political threat, these groups are having a sort of oversized level of influence without having the scrutiny that should be attached to that. So I speak to you as people who have the ears of ministers. When you speak to them about the elections bill, I think that, you know, you should be very much looking at what can be done around think tanks, and that's before we even get into things like friends of groups and APPGs. And just to pick up on the Nathan Gill case that you also mentioned earlier, I think one of the reasons that we were able to see some of his activity is because of the transparency levels of the EU are obviously much higher than ours. When you have MPs going on jaunts or fact-finding missions or whatever you want to call it, under the aegis of their APPG or their friends of group or whatever, they might register the value of the trip, but they don't register who they met or what they did there. And so you have a lot of these sort of slightly informal conversations going on, and we just don't know who's meeting whom and how that then affects their behaviour once they get back to Parliament.
Thank you, Kath. I think someone who works at a think tank, I can assure you that the Fabians Society has a transparency in terms of our donations. And contrary to what you may hear on social media, including from some cryptocurrency providers, we are not a secretive organisation. Although I'm sure many of you will see the irony of a cryptocurrency organisation criticising another organisation for being secretive. So I'm just going to quickly do one question, and then I'll pass over to the audience for two more in this round. I just want to quickly, as you might expect as the head of the Fabian Housing Centre, I just want to quickly explore, when we come to the question, the role of housing and property within this agenda and how we can prevent housing and property from being used as a real challenge. So bear that in mind. Then we're going to go to a Q&A, which means I have to go over there, I'm afraid, because as you can see, our microphones are on wires. So I have to sort of, I'm going to have to borrow yours, and I'm going to have to be a microphone stand. So who wants to ask me a question, as in come very close to me? First. Anyone? I'm not that scary. This is slightly awkward. Look, come on down. I'm afraid so. Unless, do you mind the question not being on camera? No, it's fine, it's fine. I'm going to move back. Sorry, I'm moving back. If you just want to speak loudly.
I can do that. So I'm Anya, Vice Chair of Fabian Women's, and we're definitely not a covert operation. This is really bleak and very scary and very overwhelming for people of us who are already involved in politics and active. How on earth do you get engagement, the messaging right to the member of the public that thinks reform's the next best thing? How do we start to build the bridge to get the public on board with this as a real threat?
Any more questions? Lady, we'll go this way round in the, so if we go you next, and then we'll go to this side for the next round.
Hi, Laura from International, which is a global organisation working towards gender equality. There is a rollback on women's rights and gender equality globally underway. I very much hope the UKACC stands foreign policy related to that, but closer to home. There is further funding, particularly from US-based sources, to anti-rights organisations and movements here in the UK. I'm curious, what in the here and now, so not in a future, but like what do we have on the table here that can be used to disrupt that type of financial influence that is undermining the achievement of gender equality, but also undermining democracy?
Right, we'll just answer those three questions and then we'll go for some more. So my question about the role of housing and property and how do we tackle that. Then there's a question I think that's really important about how we bring the public along and communicate it in a way that they understand. And then we also have a question on the US-based sources that are funding a rollback of women's rights in different countries. I think I'll go to Phil first.
Yeah, I'll take the second one if that's okay. So I think that is a really important question about how we're going to speak to life for people. I think that's why I spoke about high street money laundering. So I'm an MP in Bolton in the northwest of England. We don't have oligarchs. We don't have lots of reporting about shell companies. We don't have high-end, Westminster real estate, unlike my predecessor as the chair of the Joe Powell in Kensington and Bayswater. It's a different way of speaking to constituents about how the risk metamorphizes. And I think one of the things that's really important to remember, in particular about money laundering, is it's reliant on a predicate offence. So that nexus between some of those really visceral crimes, I think, is one to draw people into a discussion about the Safer Streets mission. For me, when we talk about the government's Safer Streets mission, we don't talk about economic crime. We talk quite rightly about knife crime. We talk quite rightly about violence against women and girls. We talk quite rightly about increasing the number of police on our streets, but we don't talk about economic crime. And fraud as one of those economic crimes is the largest crime. It's the largest crime figure out of all reported crime statistics in the country. So we should be talking more about it front and centre, not least because a lot of economic crime goes on these devices that everyone's looking at all the time. So I think we need to be having that education discussion in the country at large about the nexus between illicit financial flows, between money laundering, between organised crime. But as I said to Dan Jarvis to his face multiple times, that has to be a discussion that moves out of the City of London to people's high streets. And that's really important because otherwise it's a hypothetical that is read about in the daily papers, but actually people struggle to understand how it relates to their lives in their hometowns and communities. And that's what we need to be doing.
Thank you, Phil. Sue, up to you.
Yes, well, housing. Sick of that. I mean, I think, and it relates to the messaging to the public about this issue, but maybe less about the messaging about reform. But, you know, obviously, Joe Powell, who's now one of PPS at MJ, but the APG, talked a lot about that in his constituency, Kensington, about major luxury London properties. But it's not just about luxury properties. You know, actually, if you look at the recent expose about former Bangladeshi ministers who've been buying up, you know, property in the UK, this was actually, you know, it was like housing that could have been put out to rent, you know, and it was a massive property portfolio. So I think that, you know, we should be making that link actually about that, you know, this is dirty money, you know, and it isn't just petrocrats, it's also serious organised crime groups, like actually the first unexplained wealth order against a serious organised crime group was also a massive, you know, property portfolio. So property is, you know, it remains like a major kind of preferred way to invest dirty cash, and that does have a knock-on impact, I think, on, you know, it's harder to make, you know, the evidence base about how much it impacts because the problem is so large in housing that it clearly does drive out and reduces the amount of property that could be available for the public. And so I think in terms of the big messaging, I kind of feel probably that is for the politicians, but we can't afford to be too bleak. You know, actually democracy is at stake here, and actually if you talk to people who are in places like Georgia where they knew freedom and then they've had it taken away, you know, those voices are really important. Actually, it's an incredibly scary, damaging thing. You don't know how much freedom you've had until it's kind of pulled from you. So, you know, I think the politicians will have the answer about how you message that, but, you know, we have to be, you know, really wary of moving into authoritarian times, and I think it's very alarming, you know, a great percentage of young people who think that, you know, an authoritarian solution is the answer to our problems.
Cut.
Yeah, I mean, kind of do spend quite a lot of my time feeling quite gloomy, so I'm not surprised that other people do as well. But I think that, you know, there is a sort of resilience embedded in our system which should give us some cause for hope, and particularly, you know, to your point about reproductive rights, I think as a country, that is, or has always felt like a settled subject, and obviously we had the recent amendment that kind of cemented it further. So I think that there are some things that perhaps we can maybe try to tune out some of the noise and try to actually remember that actually as a society we have come quite far, and we can stay that far if we continue to make a positive case for it. It does require people, media, politicians, everyone to continue to make that case, because inevitably if we don't and it is crowded out by other people, then, you know, the Overton window shifts and people start saying, you know, well, maybe we should, you know, reconsider that. And so I think there is a kind of responsibility on people that have a public platform to make sure that they use it and to kind of keep restating those things that probably we have taken for granted for a long time, just so that we continue to enjoy them and kind of have the benefit of them.
So on housing, I mean, we have to confront the reality that the UK housing market has been the preferred store of value for kleptocrats for some time. And the model is pretty simple. It's steal it, clean it, invest it. But the invest it bit happens in Britain. And what's been terrible to watch is the way in which some of the world's biggest kleptocrats pioneered this model. But the copycats are now everywhere. And so, I mean, Susan's got different examples in our neck of the woods. If you look at the way in which Kurdish organised crime groups involved in human trafficking are now basically buying up portfolios of property across Birmingham and the West Midlands, it's just extraordinary. And then it's not just invest it, it's then leverage it, because many of those houses become houses of multiple occupation or pseudo-supported accommodation. And the tragedy is that after 9/11, we really got serious about taking out the financial models of terror groups, and now we're just not prosecuting these crimes with the same kind of vigour. And so just ensuring that we've got companies house reform and the registered beneficial ownership really sorted in this country is a good start. But it comes back to Phil's point about enforcement. Unless someone is really in charge of ruthlessly prosecuting, seizing, recycling the money back into enforcement, then we're just not really going to get on top of this. So there's still a long way to go, and we have got a special responsibility in this country for taking a lead on this policing, because so much of the value is stored in bricks and mortar here in this country. So on messaging, this is really interesting. So I've been working with Best Britain and YouGov to basically do this work on understanding the 5 tribes of reform. 3 of those groups are intractable, they are beyond the reach of mainstream parties, 2 of them are pretty tractable. And we published some research on Thursday that just shows which are the messages that move these tractable groups most. And there's a piece in the Times today that I wrote that just summarises this. So the 4 most potent messages that we found are on the economy, on employment rights, on social security and NHS access. Those are the most effective truths when you tell people what reform is proposing. Those are the messages that are most likely to cause people to flip. We also tested messages on Farage's proximity to corporate interests, on immigration, and on his affinity for the President of the United States. They tested less good. And in fact, the messaging on immigration tested worse. Open brackets, don't try and win back reform voters with immigration messaging, close brackets. But this is kind of early days still. And so, what was powerful about the New Yorker investigation into the president's fortune, so they tracked about $3.14 billion in wealth increase since he took office, overwhelmingly through crypto investments. So I think just as that news begins to metastasize, become better known, and if reform do still prosecute this argument around cryptocurrency, then I think it's going to become easier and easier for us to join those 2 dots together, and we've got to be utterly remorseless about the way that we do that, and we've got to use the elections bill to put reform politicians on the spot with smart amendments which we force them to either support or vote down so the country can truly see their colours on this. So that is what is the kind of opportunity that lies ahead. And this points out, just to come back to this point on anti-gender rights funding. So I had no idea about the scale of this until I started looking at it over the summer. The report that came out in June in the European Parliamentary Forum shows about $1.14 billion over the last 10 years, basically coming out of crazy churches in Utah into a network of European federations, and these groups are bringing court cases left, right and centre. They are funding campaigns, they are funding youth groups. They have a major influence operation at the moment. And then the irony is that when you contrast the scale of that money to the scale that we know the Russian intelligence service is putting into Western authoritarian, it's the same amount of money. It's about $35 million a year. That's the scale of it at the moment. And at the moment, that money is not easy to track or to trace. It's dark money. And so, it comes back to the point about think tanks, which I think is just such an important point. I know it's difficult. The Lib Dems tried to present this, I think, as an argument for earlier bills. I can't remember how far we got. But we've got to try and find a way of making progress in this, because it's pernicious money, and it's about rolling back rights that were hard fought.
Great, thank you, Liam. We've got about 8 minutes, so I think we've got time for 2 questions. So we go for the gentleman there, if they would like to show up.
Hi there, yeah, I'm Christian Edwards from CNN. To your point about how crypto has become the currency of choice for the Russian intelligence services, just to illustrate that, I was reporting on the Moldovan elections recently, and whereas last year they were arresting men carrying suitcases full of cash, arriving in Chisinau, now it's all crypto. And it just made their job so much harder. And so you spoke about the need to to get this bill right, and if not, we'll open it up to the dark tide of money. But I just wonder, what are the potential roadblocks you see in the legislative process? Because to us it sounds extremely reasonable. Of course there should be provisions against crypto, but do you see a sort of difficult argument to win in Parliament? What are the potential stumbling blocks?
And then, okay, we'll go for you. Yes, you.
I'm a university student. You mentioned earlier about sort of doing outreach in a couple of points about how the youth are sort of swinging to the right, to authoritarians. I mean, I see it every day from people I interact with. They see Farage falling over Instagram or TikTok. What's your plan to sort of get the people who've yet to vote to sort of get them on the side and really, get them to care about how these horrible problems affect our future?
Great. And then the gentleman there. Yes, you.
I'm totally against crypto. I think it's a complete scam. But I'm interested to hear your comments on the fact that a major crypto company sponsored a fringe over in the ACC this morning on the topic of fintech. Now, me and my colleague went in there by mistake because they chose the meeting. So we were there 15 minutes. This isn't what we were expecting. But crypto, there's a major company, Kraken, telling you what a wonderful thing it's going to be, and then just heard that chap over there. Why are we allowing it? We should say no. I can't see the benefit to an ordinary working person having crypto.
Just worth saying that it's the same company that thinks we're a secretive organisation. So I'm just conscious of everyone's asking to ask a question. We'll go for 4 questions. We'll be ready to go for 4 questions.
So I actually come from Joe Powell's constituency, so I see the effects of corruption, so it's a bit easier to translate it to the people. So the thing is, there was a property, it was owned by Russia, it was sanctioned. How that property is in limbo, there's no real way to seize it, there's no real way to buy it. That's an issue with the courts rather than Parliament. And I'm just wondering, is there a way to pass some sort of legislation or a way to deal with the court system? Because this isn't a Parliament thing, this is a justice thing, and it's just not going forward. I'm just wondering, what is the take on that? How is corruption viewed, at least, and sanction enforcement viewed by the justice system?
Great. So we've got a couple of questions on crypto, a question on university students and how we sort of deal with the sort of TikTok. I'm not on TikTok, so don't ask me. Although interesting, there was a polling of 13 to 17-year-olds who said the 3 most popular politicians were Nigel Farage, Donald Trump, and Andy Burnham, which is one hell of a tree. And then also a question on sort of how do we seize sort of property in the justice system. We've only got about 4 minutes, so if everyone could give about a minute, otherwise my colleagues will shout at me, and I don't want that. Sue, over to you first.
Yeah, crypto. I think the Electoral Commission are going to introduce some guidance this side of the election. It sounds like they're on the case. Just to give you an example of the blockers, I was giving evidence to the committee of the things on with Crypto UK, the industry, and they really were kind of convincing the whole committee that it's the cleanest, most transparent thing because there's blockchain and you can track it all out. And it was, I think he'd gone out that probably, and we needed him. But it was, they were very, very convincing. This is all we were going to get growth and we're going to make. So that's the blockage, is that, it's seen as a. But law enforcement think there should be a complete ban. I think there's an argument for having a complete ban on any crypto that can't be fully transparent. And then sanctions, it's much harder than you think. Rule of law stuff, you can't have the government saying, I'm going to seize your assets, and then, they can freeze them, but seizing them is a really big step to give that power to some government. And you can see how that could be abused by the wrong people in government. If you have the wrong people going, I'm going to just seize your property, by the way. So you do need some kind of rule of law protections around it. You need a much closer link up between, the law enforcement and sanctions. It's definitely the case that
Very lovely intelligent.
Yeah, just to pick up on the crypto point, because I think, you know, it is a really important one. When we were looking at whether Reform had received any crypto donations so far, because they have this crypto payments company which is also based offshore. My understanding is that there hasn't been anything yet, and that the checks on it are quite stringent. But I think possibly, it might have been Phil that I was speaking to about this, that the problem is that you could theoretically set up some kind of AI that would make thousands of sub-threshold crypto payments that would, in a matter of seconds, amount to several £100,000, and they would never show up because they're below the threshold. So my starting point would be, let's you know, ban it until we've figured out a way to navigate it, and you know, maybe there is a legitimate use for it at some point once we've kind of worked out how to enforce it. But back to my original point, we're not even enforcing the things that we do understand. So I don't think that we're quite ready to enforce the things that we don't fully understand it.
Yeah, I'll just come to your point about young people. We talked about the elections bill. Well, two key component parts of that we haven't mentioned yet are going to be automatic voter registration and votes at 16, which are both manifesto promises that the government is going to be putting in there. And I think the fundamental point that we need to have to address that feedback that you've got from friends and your peer group is frankly proper political education in the curriculum front and centre to make sure that our young people are equipped to spot that kind of misinformation, disinformation that's so often put about on social media. I get it all the time, as about mentioned from my constituents. I now actually ask people, where did you find out about, you know, this conspiracy theory? And all too often it's on social media, and then I push back on it. I think that's the kernel of how you address this issue fundamentally.
Don't mention conspiracies, I'm favourite.
Well, I was going to favour you about yesterday, and I did mention the Fabian conspiracy theory.
And if
Alongside
I
microchips,
for every MP that's made a joke, it's not quite good parts, but we appreciate it on that. Liam, over to you.
So I think, well, a few things. I think a ban on cryptocurrency donations will succeed in the elections bill. And I can't see a case for not having it. And so I'm sort of pretty confident. And the principle, as Kat says, is that let's not allow things that we just can't enforce. So, you know, at the moment, it's still perfectly legal for someone to move profits created in, let's say, for the sake of argument, Crimea, into the bank account of someone who, say, was a former treasurer of the Conservative Party, into the bank account of the Conservative Party. You know, that at the moment is like perfectly legal. Literally, when a couple of us wrote a complaint to the National Crime Agency to sort of flag this and say, what are you doing about this? The letter came back within about an hour to say, because the ultimate donation had come from the bank account of a UK citizen, it was perfectly legal. So, you know, it's one of those cases where it's not what's illegal that should drive you crazy, it's what's legal that should really make you cross. So it's impossible to police cryptocurrency donations, so, you know, let's just ban them. And you know, I just can't see there being much opposition to that, apart from, you know, a particular corner of the House of Commons. So I'm sort of reasonably confident that will go through. But I think the broader question actually is yours, which is how do we now begin taking apart the media political system, which is the vortex which is going to become a bigger and bigger vortex of dark money. And here we're going to have to start thinking about how we do something really bold, which is actually start regulating the algorithms. Now, what was, and people will kind of cry, what about free speech? Well, look, you don't have a human right to algorithmic amplification.
No.
You know, no one is kind of stopping you saying things. What we're going to take aim at is how the algorithms actually amplify hate speech and divide societies. And the irony here is that if you look at the permitted that just wave through restructuring of TikTok in America, you know, the Americans insist that there is a place where the algorithms are parked and inspected. We don't insist on those kind of provisions in the UK. So at the moment, you have got parliamentarians who are cashing in on ad revenue for posts that they have made, and we have no idea the algorithms behind how they got the kind of traffic that they did. So we've no idea, you know, the basis on which that money is being paid. And so, unless we're beginning to just think about how we take that final step to take apart algorithmic amplification of hate, which people then cash in on, then it's not going to be job done. Whether we get that far for the elections bill next year, I don't know, possibly not, but it's something that we can't leave as it is.
Great, thank you, Liam. So that was a really interesting panel, and I want to thank our sponsors, UK Anti-Corruption Coalition. If this has tickled your fancy in terms of Fabian events, we've got many, many more events over the next 2 days. No idea what it is. If you are not a member of the Fabian Society and you would like to join, there are QR codes and links all around our venue, and you can discover the secrets of the Fabian Society for relatively slow at £5.90 a month. But I look to end by thanking our panel, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the conference.